Hey guys, it's Andrew Grove, aka This Passing, with another replayer review video for cardrunners.com. And if you've been following along, I hope you're enjoying the first two parts. This is the third video out of 6 I think I'll be doing in the early part of this year. Just going over hands from last year and certain filters that I found interesting for me that I wanted to study and that I thought you guys would benefit from too. Today and for the next video, it's going to have hands that are featuring in 3-bet pots. So this one's going to be in position and the next one's going to be out of position. So yeah, let's not waste any more time talking, let's just get into it. So in this hand, Under the Gun limped a sort of, he's playing sort of recreationally. He's limping a lot of hands, 38%. Or his overall VPIP is 38%. His raise pre-flop is 12%, which seems pretty static. Like he's stealing about the same amount from the cutoff, the button in the small blind, around 16% or so. It seems like on average. He's calling a lot from the blind, stuff like that. His post-flop, post-flop it seems pretty normal from him. So yeah, so Under the Gun limped. This player raised. I squeezed, I guess. Is that a squeeze or not? I'm not sure if it's a squeeze, if someone limped or not, but I 3-bet nonetheless, and they both called. And we get this very dry board. And yeah, so I can show my hand now, since that's going to be the important part of the first part we're going to look into. So I have a pretty good double suited hand, high card hand. And I want to know, well, let's look. Not that part yet. So the main question I had going into this was, how should I use my ace-king hands like this to balance my my overpair value range, mainly aces and kings, since ace-king is like blockers to that. And what's the ratio, and should I check or bet them? And how much equity does my actual hand have versus different parts of Villains' ranges on this board texture? So at first, we're just going to look at some stuff pre-flop, and I think it's important stuff to consider. So pre-flop, we have about 50% versus a 13% range, and that's the range that Villain was opening from. Yes, that's his 13% raise first, about 12% from middle position. So I think it's about the same, since he's gonna be like isolating somebody. And for El Negro, it was kind of difficult to give him a range because he limps a lot of his range from Under the Gun, and it's not really, in my experience with him, it's not really, it doesn't really indicate either way. Like it's not really a reflection of his overall stats, his Under the Gun range. It's kind of a lot different from his other parts of his ranges. So the 40, 20, 8 there, I don't think it really applies to his Under the Gun range. He like limps a lot of hands there. And I think a lot of this too, I'm just going to be looking at versus middle position, but we'll see in a second. So we have, our actual hand is like flipping versus range pre-flop. So that's something to consider. We're not really pushing an equity edge or anything with this hand. Versus range. And if you did happen to have aces, we have 37% equity versus aces, so we could call a 4-bet if that's our only consideration, which it probably would be because he's so short that there's not that much money left post-flop. And okay, so getting into the meat of this, there's a lot of numbers here. Let me move some of this out of the way so it's easier to see. Okay, we can concentrate on one thing at a time. So looking at both their ranges, and I gave El Negro 20% minus 3% because I figured he'd back raise a decent amount of the time, stuff like that. But he's not limping like 40%, he's limping more like something 20, 25%. So I just was a little bit conservative and gave him just 20%. So the odds of either player having a set are better, and different other parts of the ranges, given blockers and stuff like that. So this is middle position player, the loose passive kind of player, and the loose aggressive player on the right here. And I just wanted to see like general ranges that they could continue with So in the first sub range, I have set or better. That should be 2 or better. Again, if you didn't watch in the last video, a set in Omaha Ranger means just trips or better, or like a set just means trips. So this will include full houses if it's a set or better, and then overpairs that aren't sets. So they both have around 10% or so. Give a little bit for sets, but the middle position player has an overpair like 40% of the time, even if he's not for betting aces, or even if he's so if aces are not in his range. So overall, with hands that they would consider continuing with, the middle position player will continue about 50% of the time, and the under the gun player will be about 34% of the time. And it's kind of weird. I'm talking about like middle position then under the gun, but that's kind of pre-flop raiser and then the limper or whatever. And they have a bear jack 14% and 17% respectively. That's important because that's a popular blocker hand for people to raise with and try to mess around with, and even just call with if they have ace jack. They don't have to necessarily think I have a big hand. All right, moving on. I wanted to see how this would affect their ranges if I had given given the blockers in my hand, how it would affect them. So again, the same ranges for each player pre-flop, and I had given my blockers, and it didn't really change too much. I can actually move this back up so you can see. Before it was 50%, now it's 51% for the under gun player, and it moved up a little bit more for the middle position player, and then the under gun player increased a little bit. I was kind of surprised, like, I'm blocking overpairs with this. Why is their frequency moving up? And I didn't really come to a concrete answer. I guess it's just because I'm not blocking enough of them, or I wasn't really sure. It just kind of surprised me, and I check my numbers on both ones to see. I put my dead cards in. I just didn't really understand. I thought if I'm blocking aces and kings, the subrange for overpairs minus sets would go down, but actually increase by 0.5% and 0.5% for both players. So that was really interesting for me. And let me introduce the third card here. Go down a little bit. So I wanted to see, like, do blockers really matter at all, or is this program, is it kind of bonkers or whatever? And I came to a conclusion that it's actually, it actually is accurate. So I put in Jack, Jack, King, King as dead cards. So I'm blocking, the full house hands or set hands, and I'm blocking the overpairs as well. So I think kings would be a bigger part of the range than aces would, since neither player has aces, realistically. And it did actually have an effect on it. Dropped down from 51 to 40%, and another 8% for the under the gun player. So blockers do matter, but just a couple blockers doesn't matter a whole lot. And I think possibly I could even go further with this and try it again, like somewhere in the middle. If I was blocking like ace king, if I had like ace king queen jack, how that would affect how much hands they have, because I'd be blocking pocket queens at that point. And with the 10-9, I'm not blocking hands that don't hit this board. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So the next question I wanted to say, how often do we have ace king versus, it's like the main part of what I wanted to ask in the beginning. How often do we have ace king versus our big overpairs, and how each part of our range does versus overpairs and jack XXX in villains' range. So this is mainly versus middle position, the middle position player. As you can see, I put in like my entire range on the flop to see what different parts of my range and how often I have them, versus villain's range. So this is like when he flops an overpair. So this is like how we're doing versus villain's overpair. And as you can see, we're doing really well if we have aces or kings. Set or better, obviously. I mean, that's not a huge surprise. And it's cool to see that we have an overpair over 30% of the time, so we do have a pretty strong hand a lot. And we have this ace king minus the overpair about 15% of the time, and that seems a reasonable amount. But it's also really cool to see that we have 28% versus overpairs, and I think this mainly includes against queens and kings. And it's also pretty important too, because our ace king to 9 hand has a lot of good blockers with it. I mean, not blockers. We have a lot of backdoor draws with it, like the double backdoor flush draw and wrap draws and stuff like that. Hoping that we're not like going to be running into full houses and stuff like that. But still, our equity is 28%, so that's a lot to consider. And I think because even before, like even the villains were continuing a lot, is a board where a small bet pretty much freezes the range that doesn't continue or doesn't want to continue or just totally miss the board. So and that definitely works in with our aces and kings for getting value now, and also too with our ace king hands, keeping the pot small so that we could like check back turns if we pick up a draw, or we could barrel again if we pick up a draw, stuff like that. So I think one of the answers to the beginning was I think betting here is definitely good with their overall range, and with our ace king hands as well. I don't think we want to like check back or anything, because we can still, even if we're behind, we can still suck out. We have 20% equity. That's really good versus over pairs. And then I looked at our equity versus villains' top pair hands. So his pre-flop range plus the flopped jack minus over pair or better hands. And as you can see, we have a 36% equity versus that. So if he wants to peel with like a random jack hand like jack 10 9 7 or ace jack or whatever, we still have a fair amount of equity. I guess probably a lot less for his ace jack, but still those backdoor draws would factor in a lot to this hand, I think. Okay, so next we're comparing some flop sub ranges. Yeah, that's it for this hand. But these are really, really cool to see, I think. So we're still comparing against middle position right, so that 13% minus ace. And here is range. I gave myself 10% 3-bet for this hand. That's pretty standard for me in this spot. And as you can see, our frequencies and hand counts are very similar. Like, I mean, obviously, if you subtract aces from 13%, it's about 10% for both players. Like that's pretty. I mean, we're not really pushing an equity edge or anything because we have the same kind of ranges, I think, at that point. So yeah, it's just how we balance our ranges, and the way I balance my 3-bet range is different from how someone's gonna balance their middle position range. 13% and 13% or 10% and 10%. It's usually not the same kind of hands. So just consider how you're constructing your 3-betting ranges and how that's going to affect their post-flop equities and stuff versus the opening range that you're playing against. So obviously, if I'm 3-betting 10% versus a 5% opening range, I mean that's pretty rare that someone's only opening 5%, but it happens. There are some players that raise it on the gun that tight. Or even, that's an extreme example, maybe like if I were to 3-bet 15% versus someone is opening like 13%, I'm actually 3-betting a weaker range than they open. So unless they're forwarding a lot or making a lot of mistakes post-flop, I'm actually like just putting money bad. But that's not really the case in PLO. Like in positions being there's a lot of value with that. So with my 3-bet range, that's something to consider in this spot. As far as the sub ranges go, I had like the setter better. Obviously, he's gonna have more jack hands than I am, and these X hands, stuff like that. So it's about 9% to 7%. Although it's not too big of a difference. Then I had this classification of that's too big. I was gonna say something like really smart, but okay. These 3 sub-ranges, sub-range 2, 3, and 4, are a set of hands that I think are good bluffing hands. So like double paired hands minus set are better. So like something like Queen 5-5 or 9-8, something like that would fit into this range. So if I bet small and villain wanted to check raise bluff with a hand like that, I think that's a really good idea because he has outs to he can improve to a better hand. You don't want to just like stone cold bluff with absolute air in PLO, because there's hands you can choose to bluff with that actually have outs and stuff like that. Also included top pair plus a pocket pair minus over pair, and that's not a whole lot of villains of either of our ranges. I thought that'd be a lot more hands, maybe something like Jack 10-10-9, something like that, which would have a lot of good outs and actually block Jack and stuff like that. So it'd be good for blocker purposes, but does not we don't have that many hands at all. Only like 200 out of 23,000. for me. And then the last hand, which I think is a really good bluff hand, is like an ace plus a pocket pair minus overpair or better. So for example, like ace 10 10 9. It's the same thing as a double paired hand. Like we can improve with our 10 out, and also too with the ace we block overpairs. So it'd be a more effective bluff because in this spot hero would have less hands to call with. And that's a reasonable part of villain's range. He has more of those hands than he does have double paired hands that are not set or better. So yeah, that's something to consider. And then this is the biggest thing I saw here. The last sub range, an overpair minus set or better. So how often do we each have overpairs? And villain has more overpairs than I do. I don't know. I mean, obviously none of them are ace aces. I subtracted that from his preflop range, but that's pretty critical. That means I'm almost like 3-betting too much versus villain here. So given that, I wanted to look at if we had a tighter 3-bet range, how do these sub ranges look? So I gave myself like a 6% 3-bet range instead of a 10% 3-bet range. As you can see, we have about a little more than half of the same frequency as before, or a little more than half of the frequency we had before. So we're a lot less than what we were before, and villain's range that he got to the flop with here. I don't know why I highlighted this. It's about the same, the double paired hands, but this is the critical one. We now have 6% or 5-6% more overpairs than villain does by subtracting a lot of the junk out of a 3-bet range. So versus tight players is definitely really critical to be 3-betting a tighter range, and when values could be when, like, if you're thinking about getting value post flop on boards like this. So yeah, definitely keep that in mind. And you don't want to be 3-betting if you're 3-betting for value versus a tight range. You don't want to be doing with the same percentage wise as villain's opening. So I thought this hand was really, really cool in that aspect. And as it played out, I bet small, about 1/3 pot or so, and they both folded. So pretty standard as it played out, but seeing how I could balance my my ace king range and how much equity I have versus villain's ranges, and just looking at overall ranges that got to the flop and what we can do to make it better, you know, but in this case 3-betting a little bit tighter, was a really, really cool thing to see. So that's it for this hand. I'm going to get ready for the next hand. Alright, on to the next and definitely the final hand in this video. That first hand took a long time, longer than I thought it would. So let's get through this one. So in this hand, middle position opens for $5 or 2.5 big blinds, and I don't have a whole lot of hands on him, but he's sort of on the loose aggressive side so far. I mean, only 33 hands, so you can't look too much into it, other than, you know, he might be opening a bit wider than some players. A very a player who's playing 75-33 so far, cold calls in the cutoff, and that's just another clue that he's probably you know, a beginner or just playing lots of hands in general. I have a really premium hand, and I decided to squeeze 100 big blinds or so with the middle position player, and this player is short stacking, so take that for what it's worth. I am squeezing. Original Razor folds, and this player comes along, and we see a flop that is kind of conventionally not very good for our range, but I wanted to see how bad it was for our range and how much of an advantage, if any, if the other player has against us. I think we're at a point in poker, and especially in PLO now, where we understand that this board is bad for our 3-bet range, and that we don't have a whole lot of, or like lower boards in general, we don't have as many 2-pair combos and straights and sets and stuff like that as we do, you know, something like King Jack 8, something like that, or Ace King 9, Rainbow, stuff like that. But I think we'll see that this board, we're going to find some cool stuff about this board texture and compare it to some other board textures. So let's get started. So like I said, the main question is, how bad of a board is this for hero's range compared to villain's range, and does it change if villain's range is a bit more normal, so it's not like extremely wide. So this is the initial range comparison. This is villain. I gave him 75% minus 5%, so I figured he has somewhat of a 3-bet range and at least a back raising 4-bet range. And I guess 75% is kind of loose, but that's what he was playing so far, so that's what I gave him. I was squeezing a little bit more liberally this time, since at least compared to the last hand, because both players' ranges are fairly wide, and I can do this, a fine in a value sense and not getting exploited and stuff like that. So as far as like the big made hands here, there's straights, right, which is the ST, and then also 2 pair better minus the straights. So I separated both of those, and I was really surprised initially because we both have the same amount of straights on this board, about 14.5%, almost 15%. That was really surprising for me to see. And additionally, I guess what I was not so surprised to see is that villain has a lot more 2-pair combos and set combos than we do, about 3 times as many as we do. So as far as in a hard sense, with straights and 2 pairs or better, or like just 2 pair or better, villain has us beat a little bit, 26% to 20% of our overall ranges. But in terms of flush draws, we have about 8% more. So that's more hands that we can combat with. And as far as nut flush draws, where we have them beat about 3 to 1 in this sub range 4. The 4th nut flush draw better, still we're beating it by about almost 10%, about 9% or so. And sub range 6, I just put like a pair plus gutter that did not have a set or better, and we're about equal. So just like other hands you can fight with, maybe like 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that would fall into that category. Okay. So since we're not doing as bad as we initially thought, I just looked at how our overpairs are doing versus villain's range overall on the board on this flop. So we have an overpair about 40% of the time, and we have about 57.5% equity versus overall range, which is quite a lot. I was kind of surprised a little bit, but I guess not too surprised, since villain can easily just totally whiff this board. And actually, our overall range is 51% against him on this board, has 51% equity. So that was kind of surprising to see. I thought maybe we might be at a disadvantage range-wise. And our overpairs without a flush draw even still have almost 53% equity. So that's a decent amount. And also just to note, about 12% of our hands, or 11% of our hands or so, that are overpairs, or no, about a third, I guess you could say, of our overpairs do have a flush draw, which is pretty good. Flush draws and overpairs is pretty good. Alright, so that was against a 75% without a 5% 3-bit range. That was a very wide range, right? So what if villain's range looks a bit more normal? What if he's like cold calling about 30% and minus the 3-bet range of 10%? So what if he's calling about 20% of hands versus our range? And it's even closer now. If you remember before, it was 26% with this with the 2 pair of better hands, and versus 20% for us. Now it's about almost even, almost dead even. And we actually have more straights than villain would. We actually have about 1.4% more, and he has a little bit more 2 pair combos and stuff, 2 pairs and sets. And you also see the on the other hand, the flush draw comparison, the flush draw comparison is a little bit or no, the word I was trying to say is the flush draw discrepancy is not as big. We have about, I can't do math in my head, 7% more this time, and with no flush draws, it's the gap is smaller, and strong flush draws and stuff, the gap is smaller. So when we do get played back at, it's gonna be more. We'll be running into more flush draws, I think, like flush draw plus gutter, stuff like that. So if we want to have a strategy where we bet our enough flush draws on this board to get it in, I think that's a really good idea, because a big part of the villain's range that's going to want to combat us is, pair plus flush draws himself, or just maybe like the king eye flush draw, queen eye flush draw, stuff like that. He's going to have a lot of that. He's going to consider playing back at us with, or he's going to have to make a decision with his hands and maybe check raise, or check raise semi bluffing versus us is a good idea because he's the figure that we might not hit this board as much. Just kind of true. And versus this range that I put it down here, his 20% range at this point, we're actually doing even better with that with our over pairs, just because he doesn't have as much as many of the straight combos and two pair combos. You can see those numbers. We have the upper 50s at this point compared to the lower 50s last time, except for our flop percentage, which is still about 51%. So overall, which is really good. And now just looking at the strength of our overall ranges. So I compared first the wide range that we are actually facing versus middle position versus our 20% range that we gave hypothetical villain. And I made these sub ranges for like get-in ranges that people would consider. So the first sub range is 2 pair or better, middle pair or better plus the 5th down flush draw or better. So that would include a hand like 3, 7, 8 king with the king eye flush draw, something like that. Which would definitely be in a 75% minus 5% range. I think it's that loose. And also to like middle pair plus flush draw plus gutter, so something like 2, 6, 7, 8 with any flush draw. So that would be in that range. The same thing for villain, and also too just looking at bare flush draws, how much of each they have. And as we can see, the 75% range, the initial range, is a lot better than this hypothetical 20% range on this board. Makes sense, right? 42% versus 33%. Then comparing the actual villain's range versus our range in this spot, same hand types. We're doing better than these 20% range. I think because we have a lot more, which I'll find, I think we'll look at in a second, is we have a lot more like ace-4 kind of hands, and just hands like ace-4 and stuff like that, like hands that are pocket aces, like our side cards connect with this board. So we have doing about 3% better than the 20% range with the kind of get in hands / bare flush draw hands. And then I also wanted to look at a third sub range here, like just the bare king and ace high flush draws, and we have a lot more of those than villain. I really want to look at that because if you see from before, the reason we have this discrepancy in how much more hands we can get in versus the 20% range is because we have a lot more bare flush draws. I just want to see how much of those are ace and king eye flush draws, which is about half. So when we do have bare flush draw, it's going to be really good. So that's why our equity is good in these spots. And then lastly, because when we look at this, it's like, okay, how is Hero doing so good on this board? Because it's kind of the way we've been thinking about this before is like, our 3-bit range doesn't do very good on this board. Well, or on low boards in general, right? So I want to see if we change the board texture, how does that change how good and bad we're doing? So the first board texture I looked at is 4, 5, 6 rainbow, and I just put villain's range and our range and 2 pair or better, and we are getting crushed so hard. I mean, there's no flush draws and stuff to save us. I guess I could have looked at like pair and gutter stuff too, but as far as like the actual hard hands on this board, 5, 4 or better, we're pretty crushed, 32% to about 19%. So that's a board in which villain's range is stronger than us. He has more good hands like this. And likewise, what about just 3 deuce 5 rainbow? Like, what is, how does the presence of a flush draw on a low board affect our range here? Affect our ability to play back on this board and stuff like that, and actually have strong hands and stuff. And just the board being like 5 high, allowing us to have like ace high, like 5 high straights, including like the ace and the 4, or maybe if it's like 5-4 deuce, having the ace and the 3, stuff like that, is actually really good for us. It's also too, there's like no like a 5-4 deuce, there's no like wraps and stuff too, so that's a totally different board in itself. It's really just, the idea here is that it's very specific to what the board texture is. Like the more, like it's really specific. What I'm trying to say is like the actual cards on the board like really matter as far as our hand strength and whose range is stronger on the sport on different board textures and stuff like that. So see here, there's less of a discrepancy than the 4-5-6, but it's not as much parity as the 5-3 deuce double suited board. And then I wanted to see like additionally, just to see like, is it really because of the ace-4 stuff on this board texture? Like, do we have a lot more than villain does? And the answer is yes, we have about 50% more ace-4 hands than villain does. So that is where the strength comes from. So back to the hands. This was at Zoom in October, so about a couple months ago. I think with this hand versus villain's range, I think we could go ahead and just pot call it off, given this board texture is not too bad for us. But the way I played it, I checked back. Turn to 3, villain checks again, and it's just really, at this point, villain looks really weak, and we need to get some value and protect our hand a little bit, so put out a half pot size bet, and villain folds. So pretty standard the way it played out, but really cool, I think, to look at the board texture and this specific board texture and see whose range was stronger and stuff like that. So I learned a lot from that, and I hope you guys did too. So yeah, it's just 2 hands for this this video. I'll be making the next video soon, and I'll see if I can try to like get 3 or 4 hands in there. But yeah, again, any comments, suggestions, questions, things you guys want to see, whatever, please leave it in the comment section, or you can tweet at me at ThisPassing at Twitter. And yeah, until next time, this has been Andrew Grove, aka ThisPassing, for CutterWrench.com. Thanks for watching, guys.